want to, as I said, continue on the track that we were on. I probably will talk quite a bit about some historical things tonight. We did talk quite a bit about how it got up to the time of the 300s, how the church fell away. The man of sin was revealed, which didn't happen fully at that time, but progressively. I had several asking me, how did it get to the point where we have some of these claims that are made by the Catholic Church and by the Papacy? There's four principal things. There's a lot more, but there's four principal things that they make claim to that are very distinct claims that I think ought to be tested. You can see that the system can't stand unless it has these claims to support it. It's like legs on a stool. One of those claims is the idea of what's called Petrine primacy. Petrine's a fancy word, Petrine. It just means the authority of Peter. Another thing is apostolic succession, which ties right into Petrine primacy. Another thing is papal supremacy. These are my organization in my brain, all right? This may not be how they'd organize it, but these are the key things I think we really have to show that that's a false system. Papal supremacy, meaning that the Pope is the supreme religious figure over the entire earth and over all other religious leaders, which is their claim. And then a fourth issue I think we ought to test. We won't get to it tonight because I really don't plan on going past the Reformation. But after the Reformation, this other issue enters in that really didn't raise its head so much in any direct way until after the Reformation, and that is papal infallibility. So there's Petrine primacy, apostolic succession, papal supremacy, and papal infallibility. The first two and the last two are very similar, but they're not the same thing. You can have Petrine primacy and say Peter is the principal bishop, but if you can't prove Peter was ever the Bishop of Rome, that doesn't mean anything for the Catholic Church, does it? How would they lay claim to saying that that was Peter's seat they were sitting in? So you've got to use the other tool, which is apostolic succession, that there was a passage of authority from pope to pope going all the way back to Peter. Their view, Peter was the prime and principal leader of the church, and there's an unbroken line of leaders going back to him as the first Bishop of Rome. We're going to test all that in just a minute. And if you have thoughts on it, I want you to gather your thoughts together in a basket of your brain right now and see what you get. Then there's the other two which tie together as well. Papal supremacy, which is the idea that the papacy is the highest religious office on the face of the earth, and that it has authority over all other religious offices. The natural extension of that is papal infallibility. Now, you might have complete authority, but that doesn't mean everything you say is always out of the mouth of God. But papal infallibility takes it a step further, that anything a pope speaks ex cathedra, anything he speaks in terms of teaching or doctrine to the church or on order, is as if God himself was saying it. There is no error. He's infallible. It's one of the things, strange enough, though it hadn't been claimed as directly as it was in the late 1800s at Vatican I, it's one of the things that Martin Luther stood so strong against was the idea that the Pope was uncontestable.
I was just reading about Luther tonight, and there's the four, well, there's five, but some people were four, but one of them was sola scriptura, and that the Pope did not have. He differs from the Catholics that the Pope did not have, could not add to.
Yeah, probably the two biggest things, Bruce, are sola scriptura and sola fide. Yeah. Faith alone and Scripture alone. And I absolutely agree with both of those principles of the Reformation. Either one of those, if we're not careful, can be taken to an extreme. That might sound strange. Think, how could Scripture alone ever be taken to extreme? It can. If you think that the only way you have to make daily decisions is just things you find in the Bible, you may find there's some things you're going to have to deal with. You better understand the underlying spirit of the law if you want to know how you're going to respond to that. The same thing with faith. You can go so far with faith that you think all I have to do is just have a belief system and it doesn't really matter how I live. See, there's extremes. Of course, papacy was on the other extreme of that. We've got some events going on right now that'll lead us right into this discussion. I'll talk about the future before I talk about the past. This coming Tuesday, which is the 12th, isn't it? The conclave will begin. Just to give you a very simple understanding of how a conclave works, there's nothing extremely complicated about it. There's a lot of ritual associated with it, but they basically have a vote in the morning and a vote in the afternoon. 2 votes a day. I believe it was under John Paul, he wanted to make it simpler, so he made the rule there had to be a simple majority to elect a pope. Simple majority doesn't take as much people to agree, does it? But the rule traditionally has been a 2/3 majority. And if I remember correctly, right now there's 115 cardinals with voting rights. Anybody know what will disqualify you? And I don't think of sins or immorality, because there may very well be that. What will disqualify a cardinal that's in good standing from voting on who the next pope is going to be?
Old age.
Old age. When you turn 80 years of age, you're not allowed to vote on the next pope. That's unusual, and really it can create a lot of political issues because, and this is true of this situation, the vast majority, if not every one of the cardinals, of the 115 that are going to have voting rights on the next pope were put in as cardinals either under John Paul or under Benedict. Which means if you had a pope that was in power for quite a while, let's say Benedict wasn't, but let's say you had a pope that was in power for quite a while, say 30 or 40 years, he would have put a lot of cardinals in under his authority, and now there's some, look, if you become a cardinal at 40, you're doing pretty good. So now there's some at 80. So anybody before his dynasty wouldn't have any voice in the next election, which means a pope, if he selected people for cardinals that had his own mindset, they will probably select somebody with the last pope's mindset. Do you follow the logic? There's a reason I'm bringing that up. I'll talk about it in a moment. But if there's 115 cardinals with voting rights, and that means you'd have to have 77 agree on who the next pope is going to be, I think unless there's something dramatic going on behind the scenes, that it probably will be a pretty quick decision, especially because of the timing of his stepping down. They're entering into the Easter season. None of the cardinals want to be away from their home churches on Easter, so I imagine they may be pretty quick. Sometimes it can take several years if they won't make up their minds. There's times in history it's taken a couple years before they could decide who the next one would be.
Isn't that the first time in a long time or ever that they elected a Polish pope?
Yes. Yes. It was principally Italian bishops that became the pope. It'll be interesting to see. And it's the reason I think I felt compelled to go through some of this history. I don't necessarily think anyone in this building is in this category. But in our day, we have become poor students of history. When I say we, I'm talking about our generation, and even the generation before. We've become poor students of history. Some of the decisions we're making in our nation right now, you'd never make if you were a student of history. If you've studied what these decisions have created in other nations, you'd never take this path. Studied the course that a thing runs and the destination that course takes you to. If you knew enough history, you'd think it would stop you from repeating the same mistakes of the past, but we're doing that very thing. We're repeating some dire mistakes that other nations have already made. We should have learned our lesson from. Not just one nation, multiple nations. We're imitating a failed system in so many ways. So I think it would behoove us to be better students of history. I mean, our generation. In order to do that, I feel once in a while when we get to these critical issues that we go back into some history and remind ourselves where we came from, remind ourselves of where the church came from, remind ourselves of how we got to where we're at right now. And in a day where things are much more politically correct, in a day where ecumenical statements tend to mask the real intention behind a system, we really should remind ourselves of some history.
Sometimes you think that we're kept ignorant.
Oh, I believe that, Bruce.
Absolutely.
I believe that.
That's the way the government can take over.
Yes, if the government can change the history books and nobody's smart enough to dig deep enough to find out that it was changed, if the government can just dumb a society down. And really, that's what has happened to our nation.
Absolutely.
The entertainment industry, game industry, there's an industry for that anymore. It's funny, back in the day that I grew up in even, my age is old enough that I remember the very first video games. Pong, I guess it was, that little dot that bounced around from side to side in the screen. And Atari came after that. I was alive as a child before any of that stuff came into being. Games to me were Yahtzee or Uno. Now there's an entire gaming industry, and it takes up tremendous amounts of people's time. As much time for some individuals as the entertainment industry takes, or the sports industry, or whatever it might be. The danger in extending yourself into some of those areas is that you will become dumbed down. You'll become numbed by the entertainment or whatever it is that is titillating your brain, and things will go on around you in society, and you're too busy in the fantasy world to realize that society's collapsing. And the government is more than happy to let you do that. If you want to sit in front of the TV and zone out for half the day, great for them. You won't be questioning anything they're doing if you're not paying attention. It's true of any government in history, not just ours. Power does corrupt. It's something we're going to see very clearly in this study of the papacy. You'll see that when a certain degree of power, and it's not just the papacy, but the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, the established church, the more power is given to a group in terms of secular power, in terms of political influence, the far greater intensified the possibility of corruption becomes. It takes a tremendous amount of character not to be corrupted when you're given almost unlimited power. Nobody on this earth will get power that isn't severely limited, spiritually speaking, until they're incorruptible. And a sovereign type of power to rule and reign with Christ will never be given to anyone that's not incorruptible. Because history has proven that humankind, given any amount of power they can exercise over their fellow man, always tend towards corruption. I'm going forward in time briefly, and then I'm going to go all the way back to the pre-300s AD, so we're going to drift back about 1800 years in a minute. But I'll start by saying that I think whatever happens in this papal election, there's two possibilities if we are nearing the end. I'm talking about two possibilities that could lead towards that system rising again. Right now, that system doesn't have a whole lot, publicly speaking, of good media. They've had a lot of trouble. They've had a lot of bad press, haven't they? They've been beat up quite a bit. But they are not dead. And all it takes is the right ingredients, the right series of events, and it could rise again. But you'd have to analyze that. What would it take for that system to rise the kind of power it had in the 1300s? Around the 1100s to 1300s was probably the highest peak of power in terms of overall in the Catholic system. What kind of change would have to happen? One, there could be an external change in society. It'd be hard to imagine that right now because of how blinded and how numb to conscience that society is. We're living in what's called a postmodern world. We've gone through different eras in history where there's an awakening, like the Great Awakening in a spiritual sense, in the 1800s into the 1900s even. There have been periods in time where there has been that kind of a change. There was a time when most of society was faith-based, meaning they had a confidence in faith on whatever level you want it to be, whether it's paganism or Christianity or otherwise. Then there came a time when society tested everything. They still were willing to have faith, but they wanted to test everything. Modernism is an example of that. It's the idea that we have more information now, so we can find the real truth. Modernism can be a terrible enemy of the church if it becomes critical of the church in the sense that, say for example, in the 1800s, Darwinism is a product of a modern mindset, and that is science disproves the biblical record. That's easier actually to deal with that than postmodernism. Modernism just says we have more information now, so we're challenging your archaic assumptions. Postmodernism says it doesn't matter what information you have. There is no absolute truth. That's far harder to deal with people in a postmodern world than a modern world. A modern world, you've really just got to convince them of the validity, or at least they have an emotional experience that breaks them through that wall. But in a postmodern world, you've got individuals that don't believe there is any foundational truth, that any perspective is equal. But that doesn't mean that society can't change. There have been times when society as a whole has been in a very dark place. It didn't look like there was any way they're going to get out of the mindset they were in and the doubt and the fear and the rejection of the gospel. And suddenly a great wave of revival came and it woke people up. That's what the Great Awakening was. It woke people back up in a spiritual sense. So could something externally in society create a change in the mind of individuals from this postmodern, there is no truth, to a desire to look for faith again? And if they looked for faith, there is a great power vacuum there that church could begin to rise again. The other thing is an internal change. That means a change inside the Roman system itself. That might be a little more difficult if you're just looking at the facts and figures right now, because I told you a few minutes ago that every cardinal that I'm aware of that's going to be voting, of the 115 that are eligible, is going to be voting for the next pope, were put in either by John Paul or by Benedict. And John Paul and Benedict were traditionalists. They were very conservative on morals, no flexibility on issues like homosexual marriage, for example. So if they put these cardinals in, it would seem that at least the majority of the cardinals they selected would have had their views, wouldn't you think? If that's true, it would be a lot harder to put a liberal pope in, because you've got men that were put in by fairly conservative popes before them. That doesn't mean men that were conservative when they were put in by John Paul aren't liberal now. So that could be a change as well. If the Catholic Church would change from their elitist, megalithic type of a structure that they have to a more liberal, flexible, ecumenical structure, that could create a tremendous change. So there's some things to consider. Now we're going to see if we can determine whether their two claims. I'll mention them again since everybody wasn't here. We have had several come in a little bit late. There's 4 things I think we need to focus on in testing the truth and the validity of whether the Catholic system is a true system or whether it's the producer of the man of sin, the harlot on the back of the beast. One of them is Petrine primacy, the primacy of Peter above all the other apostles. That is one of their claims, and it's important why they'd make that claim. The second one is apostolic succession. Apostolic succession being the idea that there is an unbroken lineage going back to the very first pope. And now you see why it ties into the first thing. Then the other two that tie into each other, one is papal supremacy, which is the idea that the pope is the supreme ruler over all things. It expanded pretty quickly, by the way, that he wasn't just ruler over all things religious, but that he was ruler over all civil and religious elements. But initially it was that the Pope is the supreme religious leader over every religious leader on the face of the earth. And then papal infallibility. The papal supremacy we're going to be addressing all through the history part of this, talking about how that developed. The papal infallibility I doubt we'll get to tonight because I don't want to go past in this brief history lesson the Reformation. And that really in the 1870s in Vatican I is where papal infallibility is really established. First Vatican Council is what Vatican I is. So we won't be talking about some of those issues like the Council of Trent. The 2 most important councils for the Catholic Church in the last hundreds of years, the Council of Trent and the First Vatican Council. Those were tremendously significant in re-entrenching them back into their traditional beliefs so they wouldn't be affected by the Reformation. But we're not going to get there tonight. Maybe we'll talk about that if we go that direction the next time. Let's talk about this first claim of Petrine primacy, the idea that Peter was the principal, primary, the greatest of all the apostles, and he was the head of the church, that it was Jesus' intent, that Peter was intended for that position by Christ. That is the Catholic claim. In the late 500s, the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was John IV, he was Patriarch from about 582 to 595, made the claim that he didn't use this title, by the way, the Universal Bishop. He basically used the title, he was the ecumenical patriarch. To anybody that understood what he meant the universal bishop. And it's funny because Pope Gregory the Great, who was Pope from 590 to 604, his response to John IV using this title of universal bishop was that any use of this title was blasphemous, anti-Christian, and diabolical. Now, mind you, there were 2 powers in the world at that time in terms of religious powers. There was the Patriarch in Constantinople, where the emperor was still ruling at that time, and there was the Pope in the West, where there wasn't an emperor anymore at this point, around 600. So there were rulers there, but they didn't have the authority the emperor had in the East. So the Patriarch of Constantinople is claiming he's the universal bishop, and the Pope's response to that is it's diabolical, it's anti-Christian, and it's blasphemous to claim a title like that. It's amazing. It was 604 when Pope Gregory the Great passed out of his papacy, and just 3 years later, Pope Boniface III in 607, he was only Pope, I think, for about 9 months. Boniface appealed to the emperor in the East, who at that time was Phocas, that you need to remove any of these titles from these Eastern bishops and give them to the Western bishop. Now, mind you, 3 years before that, the Pope said it's blasphemous, anti-Christian, and diabolical to even use this title. Just a 3 year later, Pope appealed to Phocas to remove this title from the Eastern bishop and give it to him, and Phocas did. Phocas took that title away from the Eastern bishop and said the Pope was the universal bishop. And he even said he is the See, S-E-E. It's a word you'll hear a lot in the Catholic vernacular. See is not like a sea that rolls with waves. It's not like a sea like seen. It's a seat of authority. S-E-E, the See that the Pope has, the papal see, S-E-E, is his seat of authority. He said the see of Blessed Peter the Apostle, meaning the Pope, should be the head of all the churches. That's 3 years after the prior Pope had said it's a diabolical, blasphemous, and anti-Christian thing to claim that. So you see what kind of a mess that was. Focus, the emperor who gave them this title, and remember, you had a religious leader, the Pope of Rome, making an appeal to a secular leader, not a higher authority. Because you'll see in the papal statements, they do not see the emperor as higher authority than them. They see him as a secondary authority. He makes this appeal to Focus, a secular power, to give him the title, a religious power. You see how strange that is? If that's not bad enough, if you make a study of the life of Focus, it may not be someone you'd want to give you a religious title. Focus, when he took control of the Roman emperorship, deposed the emperor that was before him in a pretty brutal way. This emperor had, I think, 6 sons and a couple daughters. And his daughters and his wife and one of his sons were traveling. And when he deposed this emperor, he took him captive, and he took his 5 sons, and he murdered his 5 sons in front of him, made him watch. And then he killed him. And then he hunted down his 6th son, murdered him. He hunted down his wife and daughters and executed them. And this is who gave the Western Pope the title Universal Bishop. Sounds like somebody you'd want to have on your ticket. If you're a thug, maybe, but yeah, it wasn't much different than Constantine. Constantine was just as bad. He was a murderous rogue. So that just gives you a little background for the kind of tension that was going on between the East and the West. It went on between the Eastern and Western bishops, meaning the Pope and the Patriarch, but it also went on later between the Pope of Rome and the Eastern Roman Emperor. Because when the Pope of Rome became more of a power in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Emperor from all the way over in Constantinople was trying to give him direction, there were periods when there was tremendous tension there. The Pope was saying, you aren't a power to tell me how I'm to operate. And of course, that caused all kinds of tension a little later in history. So we'll talk about this Petrine. That's a word you probably ought to know if you're going to study at all anything regarding the Catholic Church. Petrine primacy. The primacy of the Apostle Peter over all other leaders. What are the possible reasons why someone would think this? Can you think of some reasons why someone might consider that Peter might be of a higher authority than the rest of the apostles? Leslie?
Because he said, on this rock.
That's the most traditional and used one in Matthew 16. That is, by the way, the very first one I've found in my studies of history that the popes begin to use as a reason why they should have primacy over all the other bishops. They would go back to Matthew 16. Before they use any other argument, they'd go back to Matthew 16. In fact, the very first pope that ever claimed papal primacy in writing was in the 200s. And his main reason was because some problems going on in the church. It wasn't that he was trying to rule over all the other churches yet. It wasn't at that point yet. But there were issues, and he said he had the primacy really to judge those issues. And his argument was exactly that. Matthew 16, Jesus said Peter was the rock. It's interesting if you study the early church. I don't really like calling them fathers because some of them weren't someone I'd consider a father to me. But some of the early church leaders that followed the apostles, the majority of them, if you look at how they interpreted that scripture, saw that scripture as applying to either Christ or to the statement of faith Peter made. There was only a handful in the first couple hundred years that ever made the claim that was talking about Peter. Doesn't mean they're right, but that's one point. That is the key, Leslie. That's the most used reason. But there's some biblical reasons other than that. You notice that Peter acts out and speaks out more than any of the other apostles, doesn't he? So someone might read into that was intended. He was supposed to be the spokesman. And there's several scriptures that seem to allude to that. Matthew 16, where Leslie talked about, he said, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." That's their principal reason they go back to. That's the 18th verse, isn't it? Somebody read me the 23rd verse. Now, mind you, if he just made the statement, "You are the rock," and this is the first pope, look at this. Isn't it glorious? Now, what's the 23rd verse say? Jesus talking to Peter 5 verses later.
"Get thee behind me, Satan. Thou art an offense unto me, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men."
5 verses after Jesus supposedly, and I don't believe this, but 5 verses after Jesus allegedly said Peter was the great foundation he's going to build his church on, Satan is working through Peter 5 verses later. That takes away a little credibility, doesn't it? I didn't bring these two up the last time we talked about this, But here's two more simple reasons why I don't think that Peter would have thought of himself that way. If you read 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter, it's one of the beautiful poetic passages about Jesus being the foundation, the rock, the stone of stumbling, the rock of offense. He doesn't refer to himself as the rock. Peter doing the talking. In 1 Peter 2, he says, to whom coming as unto a living stone. Now, you know what the sad thing is? Peter himself referred that to Jesus, to whom coming as unto a living stone, disallowed indeed of men, but chosen of God and precious. Ye also, as lively stones, plural, are built up a spiritual house. So you see that Peter didn't look at himself that way. Peter viewed Christ as the foundation stone in his own words. And then there's a secondary example I haven't heard too many people use, but it is interesting, and that is the book of Mark. Mark was almost without doubt a disciple of Peter. And most traditions would tell you that Mark's gospel was written like a secretary would write a biography for somebody. That Peter told Mark the events that happened, and Mark wrote the gospel. Isn't it strange that if Peter was supposed to be stated to be the rock on which the church is built, that Peter himself wouldn't have told Mark to write that in his gospel? It's not in Mark's gospel. Of all people, don't you think Peter, if he was trying to show that he was the prime one, would have said, don't forget, by the way, Mark, what Jesus said to me about how I'm the rock. But that wasn't even in Mark's gospel, which was probably taken from Peter's account. Here's another reason why someone might say this about Peter. He was singled out by Jesus with the command to strengthen the brethren in Luke 22, 31 to 32. When Jesus told him about the trial of his faith he was going to go through, and he said, and when you're converted, strengthen the brethren. That would leave somebody that was looking for Petrine's primacy to say, see, Jesus specifically told him, you're the ones to strengthen the brethren. Another reason would be Jesus singling out of him in John 21, 15 to 19, when he told him to feed his sheep, as if that gave him an authority of feeding the sheep in a way the other disciples didn't have. I don't agree with this, by the way. I'm showing you where they'd come up with this. It's another example of one of those that you need to just go a couple verses later to see if it's really such an honorific statement. That's John 21, 15 to 19. If you read the 20th to the 22nd verse, Peter tries to draw attention away from himself by drawing attention to John. And if you were to look at this contextually and culturally, what Jesus is really saying back to him is, it's none of your business. He doesn't word it quite like that, but you might as well say that's what he's saying. That's really what he's saying when Peter says, what about this one? What about him? He goes, basically, he's saying it's none of your business. If he was trying to demonstrate Peter's great primacy, a few verses after that, when he asks about another apostle, he says, none of your business, Peter. So that tends to take away some of the credibility. And then I think one of the more obvious examples is in the 2nd chapter of Acts, when the brethren come out of the upper room and Peter is a spokesman, isn't he? Even into the first few chapters of Acts, Peter and John are the principal spokesmen that we see their stories recorded. Now, it's not Peter alone. That's important. It's Peter and John. But they seem to be the principal spokesmen, not only in the preaching that's going on in Jerusalem, but even when Philip sends for the brethren to come up to Samaria, it's Peter and John, isn't it? But it's not Peter alone. It's Peter and John. Peter is the first one to go to the household of Cornelius. In other words, he's the first one to open the door of the Gentiles in Acts 10. Paul made a pretty strong statement about Peter in terms of his role. He said it like this in Galatians 2, 7 to 8. When they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, the uncircumcision of the Gentiles, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter, for he that had wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me towards the Gentiles. Now, what Paul was referring to would seem to be, I was the apostle that was primarily for the Gentiles. Peter was the apostle primarily for the Jews. That's a pretty big role to have. But there's a serious problem with that tying into Peter's primacy over the church, because Rome was not a Jewish church. Well, if you're arguing primacy there, and Peter was the primary apostle to the Jews, the Catholic Church was not a Jewish church. Now, there were Jews in Rome to begin with, but very soon after the fall of Jerusalem, there were very few Jews, and after the turn of the first century, there were almost no Jews in the church. So if Peter's role was to be the primary apostle to the Jews, that role would have ended with the Jews. And it would be Paul they should be trying to build their papal system on, not Peter. He was the apostle of the Gentiles, wasn't he? And you could make a lot greater case for Paul being in Rome than Peter, because Paul certainly was in Rome.
Paul also rebuked Peter pretty stiff.
That's one of the cons we're going to get to. The pros are where we're at now. We're almost done with the pros. That's one of the good cons, though. That's one of the negative arguments. So the fact that Peter and Paul were the key men used to preach the gospel to the Jews and Gentiles does not necessarily make them positional leaders of all the churches. They were the principal pioneers. Somebody had to be the principal one to bring the message. That doesn't mean they were going to rule over them. Do you realize who the principal one to bring the message to the Samaritans was? Philip. Does that mean Philip now is the ruler of any church that opens up in Samaria? That's not how it works. Quite often the person that starts the work is not the greatest power. There are greater powers. Philip started the work. He opened it up. He was the evangelist that opened it up. But it required a higher level of authority to establish that work, and that's where Peter and John showed up. There is without doubt a seniority among the apostles. But it narrows down, I think, to no less than 3 at a time. I don't ever see a time there's less than 3 in the early church. Whether Peter, James, and John, the initial Peter, James, John, and Andrew in Jesus' ministerial period, even after James, the brother of John, died, it was still Peter, James, and John. There was another James, the James that was there in the 15th chapter of Acts, brother of Jesus. And later there was a Paul. So you had at least 4 principal men, if not more than that. And I doubt you'd want to say any one of those was over the others. It seems like in certain circumstances and for certain conditions, God raised one up over the other. There was no one man that stayed in a position over all the rest. There are times Peter, without doubt, was the spokesman. And there's other times he was the one getting spoken to. Brother Lee brought up him being rebuked. We'll get to that. There were times that, without doubt, Paul was the great spokesman. And there were times Paul and Peter were being spoken to on what the condition was going to be. In 15th chapter of Acts, Council of Jerusalem, the results of that council were instructive to both Paul and Peter's actions. And it wasn't Paul or Peter making that decision, was it?
It was James.
It was James. Leader of the church. And that wasn't even James, the brother of John. That was James, the brother of Jesus. So somebody that hadn't even been among the initial 12. That's even more unusual, isn't it? So God can raise up men, and it doesn't mean he's bringing someone else down. It just means at that moment, that person has a more of a primacy in the role that they have. But I don't believe God intends to put one person in a permanent position of primacy. He uses people based on their gifts and the purpose he has for them. Let's go through some of the negatives. Some of the arguments against the idea that Peter is the primary and principal of all the apostles. It could very well be that a lot of Peter's outgoing statements, his words and actions that were so forthright and extroverted and gregarious in their nature, were a product of personality more than position. He had a personality that pushed himself to the front. And God can use that. But I don't think that meant he automatically had a position because he pushed himself to the front. I've seen people push themselves to the front that didn't have a position at all. Or sometimes the person who is least weighty is the first one that wants to leap up. That doesn't mean because you're the first one jumping up that you're the one who has the primary position. Another thing that's pretty strong is that Jesus promised all 12 of the apostles would sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. He didn't say there would be a throne that Peter would sit on, which is exactly what the popes believe. They believe Peter has a throne that's higher than any other throne. No. He said, you will sit on 12 thrones. In Matthew 19:28, you shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. I didn't bring this up as a pro because it so quickly unravels. But even though Peter was the one who initially in Acts 1, it was Peter that suggested they need to replace Judas, so they would be back to the number 12. If you notice the pronouns here, they, after Peter suggests this, all the apostles appointed the 2 candidates, all the apostles prayed, and all the apostles drew lots. Says they in each of those cases. I think that's the order. They appointed the 2 candidates. They chose them out. They prayed over them. They drew lots. Not Peter. Peter didn't choose them. Peter wasn't the one praying over them. And Peter didn't decide who was going to fulfill that role, did he? So that seems to fall right into the pattern of what Jesus' purpose was, that the 12 would operate as a unit. And there would be times that there would be someone, based on their calling, based on their talents and gifts, that would rise a little higher in certain areas. We mentioned this a few minutes ago, but Peter was not the leader of the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, was he? Peter was waiting, so to speak, to hear what the final rule was going to be, to know how we're going to handle this. Peter had gone to the Gentiles, and now he wanted to know how it's going to be handled. Paul was now going out to Gentiles. How are we going to handle this? What are we going to require of the Gentiles? In our modern logic, You would think, let Paul or Peter decide this. They're the first two Peter was the first that went to the Gentiles. Paul's the one that really feels called to go to the Gentiles. Why shouldn't they decide? They didn't. It was James who, at least I don't know that you could say it was structured intentionally this way, but however that meeting went, it was James who had the final word. It may not have been intended, and this is how the Spirit leads sometimes, it may not have been that they orchestrated it that way and said, once we have our discussion, James is going to tell us what to do. It may have just been that the Spirit of God came on James and he started to speak, and they all knew it was the Spirit of God, and James said what needed to be said, and the conversation was over. Peter's final appearance in the book of Acts, what chapter is that in? Kind of an odd place for his final appearance to be, because it almost was his final appearance. That should help you. His final appearance in Acts was almost his final appearance.
That's when he got out of jail.
Thank you, Kevin. That's when the angel took him out of jail. The angel hadn't taken him out of jail, it would have been his final appearance, period. Because they were going to put him to death just like they'd put James to death. That was Peter's final appearance in the book of Acts, and that's the 12th chapter. Now, how many chapters does Acts have? 28. Who is the object of more than half of the book of Acts in terms of their life and their acts? Paul. The next 16 chapters are about Paul. So isn't it interesting, if Peter is the primary one above all others, that he got a lower billing than Paul did in terms of the book of Acts? He was there for the first 12 chapters. Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, the 12th and 13th verse, really seemed to lead towards the idea that he certainly did not support the idea of a one-man authority. So there was a lot of division and contention in that church over who they were going to follow in terms of their leader. Who's going to be the one that I'm going to look to? Every one of you saith, I am of Paul, and I of Apollos, and I of Cephas. Cephas is Peter. And I of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? Isn't it amazing how different Paul's spirit was when that really, more than any other leader, was Paul's church? If there's anyone that appears, at least in the record, to have done more in the church at Corinth than anyone else, it was Paul. And yet he even makes a statement to them, you weren't baptized in my name. I wasn't crucified for you. How different the Catholic system became just a few hundred years later when it was about that man. Paul didn't want it to be about any one man. It's not about any one man. It's about Christ crucified. It never has been about any one man but the man Christ Jesus. And any time we make a church about a man, we will always go off track. The only man the church can be centered upon is the man Christ Jesus. We're all temporary workers in the vineyard anyway. Another example in 2 Corinthians, 11th chapter and the 5th verse, where Paul makes this statement, I suppose I was not a whit behind the very chiefest apostle or apostles? Apostles. Paul saw that the chiefest leaders of the church were a plurality, didn't he? The chiefest apostles. And Paul's statement was that he was not one whit behind them. Now, what is that really saying in modern terms? Simply, I am on the same level as the very chiefest of the apostles, plural. Which means he knew there were other chief apostles, and he knew that God's calling on his life put him on par with those other chief apostles. Which means Peter had no primacy over Paul in that statement, did he? Doesn't seem as if he's saying there's a chief apostle. And then the last proof of this is in Galatians 2, 11 to 14, when he mentions what Brother Lee brought up, the contention that Paul had with Peter. He certainly doesn't seem to be showing any untoward deference towards Peter in this statement, is he? He's saying Peter was wrong, I had to correct him. It doesn't seem disrespectful. He seems to have truly respected Peter. When he met with the leaders of the church, said, I met with Peter, James, and John, they appeared to be pillars. He certainly respected Peter. And Paul had possibly a right to do that, given he had more of a prominent role in regard to the Gentiles than Peter, which is what he was referring to earlier that I quoted. I think if you look at all the evidence, when you take the counterbalancing evidence I just gave you, the statement by Peter himself, statements by Paul, the structural situations going on in the church, I don't think you could make the argument that Peter was the one single primary apostle, could you? Brother Don, do you have something?
Yeah, before going into the apostolic succession, could you spend a brief moment with the keys?
The keys on the papal insignia? There's a gold and a silver key that's part of the papal insignia, especially on their coat of arms. They have cross keys that are gold and a silver key. They believe that means that they have been given the inherited authority that Peter was given. Remember, Christ said, what you bind in heaven will be bound on earth. What you bind in earth will be bound in heaven. And they think that that means when Jesus said, I'm going to give you the keys of the kingdom, they think that's a key to bind things in heaven and a key to bind things in earth. And if you want to take it to the deeper layer, that means they believe they have authority, the key. You know, a key when the key of the house of David was put on the shoulder of Eliakim, a key represents the authority over something. You can open it, you can close it. So when Jesus says, I have the keys to death and hell, I have the power over it. So a key represents the fact that you have power over something. So the two keys on the papal insignia represent the idea that they believe they're holding the keys of Peter. That's part of that Petrine supremacy, a new word, Petrine primacy and papal supremacy. I'm just inventing words right now. Supremacy is that they're holding the two keys, gold and silver, representing initially what Jesus said to Peter, what you bind in heaven will be bound on earth. What you bind in earth will be bound in heaven. Two keys for binding things in heaven and binding things in earth. But they take it far further than that. One key is authority over everything in the religious realm. One key is authority over everything in the civil realm. They believe they have the keys, that they have the power and authority over all the religious realm and all the civil realm. It's a pretty bold thing to put on your personal insignia, isn't it? All right, let's talk about apostolic succession because it dovetails right into this issue of Petrine primacy. It's the tradition that Peter was the first bishop, and that bishopric, that inherited office, has passed down pope to pope to pope, all the way down to the current, which means whoever they elect in the next week or so, if they do it that quickly, they believe has all the vested authority going all the way back to Peter, and that he's holding the exact same office that Peter would have had as Bishop of Rome. I know several of you have some experience with the Catholic Church. You may know better than I do. But the most common tradition I'm aware of is the belief that Peter, in the Catholic teaching, that Peter was Bishop of Rome from around 41 to 66 when he was killed by Nero. Same time period Paul would have been killed. Let me give you their evidence for some of the reason why they would say this. Some of the early Christian writers in the first couple hundred years, there's a lot more later which would make sense because they're trying to establish that. But in the early period, in his letter to the Romans written around 110 AD, Ignatius of Antioch, this is one of the things they would use to prove that Peter was the first bishop. It's kind of an odd way to do it, but he remarked that he could not command the Roman Christians the way Peter and Paul once did. Well, that doesn't mean they were the bishop of Rome because they commanded the Christians. You could write a letter to them, couldn't you? Doesn't make you their bishop. Irenaeus, in Against Heresies, around 190 AD, said that Matthew wrote his gospel while Peter and Paul were evangelizing in Rome and laying the foundation of the church. Still doesn't narrow it down to Peter being the bishop, even if they both were evangelizing. And just because somebody says this 150 years later doesn't mean it happened. A few lines later in Against Heresies, he makes this statement, and this is where we get part of the papal succession that they believe happened. He says that Peter was followed by Linus, Linus was followed by Anacletus, and Anacletus was followed by Clement. So they believe that the first four bishops, based on that, Peter was the first. And Tertullian, now this is another decade later, this is around 200 AD, said that Clement was consecrated the Bishop of Rome by Peter. So there's some of the early writers' evidence. That's about as good as it gets, by the way. There's not a whole lot more proof than those few statements. Some believe, though, that Peter was referring to Rome when he made the statement at the end of 1 Peter in 1 Peter 5:13 when he said, "The church that is at Babylon, elected together with you, saluteth you, and so doth Marcus my son." They don't believe he was talking about Babylon in Mesopotamia. They think he was using a symbolic reference to the fact that he was in Rome. Some say that's proof Peter was in Rome. He's sending greetings from the church that's at Babylon. So that's as good as it gets, by the way. Let's go through a chronology of what Peter was doing and see if we could have him sitting in Rome from 41 to 66. Now, bear in mind, it isn't like today where you could fly to Rome one day and be back in Jerusalem working or Antioch the next day. These are major journeys to move around the countryside. So let's see where Peter was at different times. Around 44 AD is when he was imprisoned in Jerusalem. So he certainly wasn't in Rome there. If the tradition knows he was the bishop from 41 to 66, he was imprisoned in Jerusalem around 44. Around 52 is when the Council of Jerusalem happened. He was there. Around 53, he was in Antioch because Paul came and visited him there. It's mentioned in Galatians 2. So he wasn't in Rome in 53, at least that part of the year. Around 58, Paul wrote his letter to the Romans. He did not address Peter. He didn't mention Peter being there. He actually, I think, addressed 27 people by name in that letter and never mentioned Peter at all. So if Peter was the bishop, don't you think if you're going to write a letter to Peter's home church, you're going to at least greet or mention Peter in it? And then 61 AD, Paul was taken prisoner to Rome. Never mentions Peter being there, never mentions any communication with Peter. In Paul's epistles that he wrote from Rome during his imprisonment, he mentions no mention whatsoever of Peter being with him in Rome or Peter visiting him. Don't you think if Peter was the bishop in Rome, he would have visited Paul? Certainly. How often would they have gotten to connect? You think if they were both in Rome, they definitely would have connected. No mention. And then finally, in his final statements to Timothy, right prior to his martyrdom at Rome, at the time when if Peter wasn't there, he was on his way there because they were martyred pretty close together according to tradition. This is a statement he made at the end of 2 Timothy in the 4th chapter, the 11th verse. Only Luke is with me. Doesn't sound like Peter was there. Only Luke is with me. So you see some of the problems? I think those are some pretty strong arguments against the two issues that we brought up. One, the Petrine primacy issue, that Peter was the principal one. Certainly there were times that Peter was the principal one. And there were times he was not. But papal supremacy requires Peter to always be the principal one. Because if you would make the case that Peter's sometimes the one that God uses principally, then you'd have to make the case, if you believed in the Roman Catholic order, that sometimes the Pope is the principal one, and there's other times other bishops may be more principal than him, and I promise you they're not going to accept that. But certainly there's times Peter was not the principal one, and there's times he was. I think there's very little evidence that demonstrates that Peter was the first bishop of Rome. There's a few statements that seem to be that case, but any of them that are made that directly are made quite a while after the fact. Decades, if not 100 years after the fact. Not only that, they're made by men that are not inspired writers of the Bible, so you cannot have the same confidence in their statements as you would in the Scripture. And not only that, even if Peter was in Rome working, it does not make him the first bishop of Rome, does it? Looks to me like Paul had a lot more authority than Rome than Peter, in terms of at least the writings we see from Paul.